Hello, I'm Natalie Wagner, President of the Wagner Society of New York. It's a pleasure to greet you, including many registrants from abroad, especially down under, and to introduce you to our friend Heath Lees, who is in New Zealand. He is a renowned speaker and author of a book on Mallarmé and Wagner. By the way, we also have another friend in New Zealand, the New Zealand Society's treasurer, who was a New York Society member until she married a Kiwi. Our society was founded in 1978 and has presented many programs every season. We're known for our annual seminar on a Wagner opera in the current Met repertoire, and nearly every international Wagner soloist who has sung at the Met has participated in our Met cast roundtables, which are an essential part of these seminars. When our Dutchman seminar was canceled 2 days before the event in March, we presented it as a virtual seminar with the participation of every speaker and 2 cast members over 2 evenings. We also present recitals featuring promising Wagner singers who have received awards and grants from our singers programs. I have exciting news for you now. Coming up in early December, a masterclass with 3 promising tenors conducted by Stefan Gould, one of the greatest Helden tenors of our era, who is enduring the lockdown here in the Northeast. We will have a link on our website to register for this very special event very soon. Heath made a US and Toronto tour of 6 cities in 2015, including New York, of course. The Consul General of New Zealand in New York attended that event. Heath concentrated there on musical aspects of the ring with piano illustrations, but in Alex's new book, we learn much, much more about the art and politics element in the Shadow of Wagner. In our book catalog, Alex's book is available for domestic orders through a link from our website. Heath was a reader for the book and reviewed it for the Wagner Journal, and he is cited twice, which I learned from the excellent index for the book. Alex has visited New Zealand and lectured there before the book was published. It was reviewed for our society in the October issue of our publication, Wagner Notes, by Professor Simon Williams. His review is also online with a link from our website. I now turn the program over to Alex and Heath with many thanks. The program will soon be posted on the Society's YouTube channel.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And even bigger thanks to you and the Wagner Society of New York for working so hard to put this web event together. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. Alas, we can't see you, but we know you're there. So glad you could join us. I know you'll find it was worth it. Oh, and by the way, Natalie mentioned that masterclass with Stephen Gould. It's in December, it's in the 11th of December, and we now have the time, it's 7 o'clock Eastern time. Me, I have 2 jobs for starters. The first is to introduce this book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. And secondly, to introduce the book's author, Alex Ross. In all the reviews I've read so far, there are 2 words that keep coming up. One is breathtaking. That usually refers to the scope of the book. And the other is magnificent. That usually refers to the reader's experience of being transported on an 800-page journey through 150 years of Western cultural history, as seen through the influence and ideas of that utterly amazing artist and hugely perplexing human being, Richard Wagner. Now the hot news is that the book has been out for only a few months and has already gone into its 2nd printing. The Wagner Society of New York, as Natalie has said, is offering the book for $29.99 US, including shipping for domestic sales. You can get to the offer through a link on the Society's website. Just Google Wagner Society NY and it will all fall into place. And of course, the book and its Kindle version is also available through Amazon.com. As for the author of this book, well, you probably know Alex Ross already, either through his music columns in The New Yorker or through his previous books, especially the 2 multi-award-winning ones that opened up 20th century music to readers and audiences old and new. One of these books was entitled The Rest is Noise, and the other was called Listen to This. In today's world, no one writes about music more penetratingly, more engagingly, or more revealingly than Alex Ross. And we're delighted to have him here in the virtual flesh, as it were, to tell us more about this book, the epic result of more than 10 years of Wagner research. Alex, it's a delight to greet you for our web-based conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Heath. And it's an absolute delight to see you again after our meeting in New Zealand a few years back. And it's really a great honor to be before this very distinguished gathering of the Wagner Society. I wish, of course, I could be there in person and meet many of you, but this is the best we can do under the circumstances, and I'm just so pleased by everyone's efforts to make this happen.
Your book has been out for a couple of months now, and it's been selling fast. Do you think people in general were already aware of the huge influence that Wagnerism has had in so many areas for the last 150 years? Was there already public? Or are you, through your book, making them ready like the rest is noise did?
I think in general, there was not so much awareness, perhaps very little awareness in the wider public of the real scope of Wagnerism. And what I've found anecdotally, talking about this topic, talking about Wagner generally over the years, is that associations with Wagner, ideas about Wagner in the general public, and I'm including here, perfectly cultured, educated people, kind of tend to get boiled down to a few very familiar, perhaps all too familiar characteristics. And what do people think of when they think of Wagner? They think of a sort of grandiosity, bombast, works that are very long and perhaps somewhat tiring, sprawling, and so on and so forth. So just this association with hugeness and extended duration, and then the association with suspect ideology, with anti-Semitism, with Nazism, and really, it boils down to, I think, that if there's one fact that everyone or most people know about Wagner, it is that he was Hitler's favorite composer, and that unfortunately is the sum of a lot of people's knowledge. And so I had a lot of work to do in this book to broaden people's understanding of the breadth of Wagner's influence and impact. And I think it really, it came as a surprise to many people. These associations that, of course, people who follow Wagner closely are very aware of, whether it's Baudelaire or Thomas Mann or James Joyce and various other figures. And so there was a kind of agenda behind the book. I mean, first of all, to tell this story at length, which hasn't really been done between the covers of a single book before. And so that just seemed to be worth doing in and of itself. But also to use the story of Wagnerism, of his influence, as a way of broadening and enriching perspectives on Wagner himself, without, of course, losing sight of all of those problems of sort of the perpetual crisis, in Wagner and around Wagner. So I sort of wanted to somehow do all of that at once.
But the perspective that you broaden is also perspective through Wagner on cultural history. And there's a bit at the start of the book where you spell out the book's massive reach, and it is a massive reach. And you say, and I'm quoting here, Wagnerism was a cult that spread through the entire sphere of the arts: poetry, the novel, painting, theatre, dance, architecture, film, ... It also reached the realm of politics. Both the Bolsheviks in Russia and the Nazis in Germany used Wagner's music as a soundtrack. Wagner was arguably the presiding spirit of the bourgeois century that achieved its highest splendor around 1900 and then went to its doom. Wow. Wagner, the presiding spirit of a whole century. People might ask, are you not overdoing it? Was he really that important?
Well, of course, we know, so many of us know watching here, that he was indeed such a towering figure, but it has been partly forgotten. I think it comes as a surprise to realize how absolutely ubiquitous Wagner was in fin de siècle culture. How you really couldn't be a sort of rising young artist in that period without having some kind of stance on Wagner, even if it was to sort of completely reject him. Wagner was just sort of this object that he needed to kind of make your way around in one way or another. And so I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration, because he was just this behemoth at the center of everything. And at the same time, I mean, there is a curious aspect to this book, which is really what drew me very much to the project as well, in that ultimately it is not so much about Wagner himself. It is about this period. It is about this expanse of culture in the fin de siècle, which is a period that I've just always been drawn to very strongly. And Wagner becomes the lens through which to view this period. And so it becomes sort of a history of the period told through Wagner. And that, I think, also is, I mean, it was just fundamentally very appealing to me, and just sort of so much of the territory that I traverse in this book in terms of literature and visual arts and various other cultural disciplines it's just territory that I dwell in all the time anyway, and have, since I was a college student or before. I wrote my senior thesis in college on Joyce, and I've been just unnaturally obsessed by Thomas Mann since before college, and so yeah, these to have the opportunity to revisit these figures and discover new figures as well was what made this whole experience, the decade-long experience of working on the book, largely a joyous one. I mean, the writing of the book certainly presented challenges, and there are times when I just felt completely overwhelmed and wondering what I'd got myself into. But the immersion, the immersive aspect of it, the research, the reading, the visiting of museums, the sort of the watching of films, and so on and so forth, this was just incredibly rich, and it was just the greatest education of my life, as I said in the introduction to the book.
One of the things about the effect and the influence of Wagner is that it was so many-sided. You make the point early on in the book that Wagner had this impression upon people because he was never just a composer. Right at the start, you mentioned that your book is not a book about music. Some people have been aggrieved at that because I think they think that if it's about Wagner, it must be about music, and specifically about music. It's really a book about Wagnerism. In other words, it's a book about Wagner's influence. Of course, you don't ignore the music. In fact, when you start writing about and describing Wagner's music, it's just captivating what you say. So the music is included, but you're concentrating too on what the music stirred up in people and on what Wagner stirred up through his writings. You have a neat twist on a phrase from Nietzsche when you say that as a writer, Wagner was prolific, all too prolific.
Yes. Well, this was, I think, also very much at the core of the phenomenon. Wagner was not simply a composer. And it's funny, I'm sure you've experienced this as well, writing about Wagner. You just don't want to say Wagner, Wagner, Wagner over and over again, in every sentence. So you try to come up with sort of other words to sort of substitute epithets and so on. And of course, sometimes you're tempted to call him the Meister, although that sort of has a somewhat creaky sound. And if you're feeling especially florid, you call him the Sorcerer of Bayreuth or something. But basically, in my book, I kept calling him the composer, to avoid having the word Wagner, 3 times in every sentence. But he wasn't a composer. he was a dramatist, a composer and a dramatist and a theoretician and a conductor and a theater designer and a kind of part-time architect and a promoter and a festival planner. And so he filled so many roles. But the two essential roles were composer and dramatist. And the appeal of these works, I think, rests just as much in the texts, just as much in the dramas as in the music. I mean, it's hard to sort of distinguish one from the other, but they were distinct creative processes for Wagner. And of course, as we all know, he wrote the entire huge libretto of The Ring before setting to work on the score, accepting those sketches for Siegfried's Tod, which came very early in the process. And so he would write the text and then sort of turn to the text almost as if it was coming from someone else and sort of set it to music, and not really make that many changes as he went along. So his identity as a dramatist and as a person of the theater, I think, is so important. And people loved these texts, loved these stories. And Wagner was sometimes read before he was even heard. People would read the librettos before they heard a note of the music, or maybe they just heard an excerpt here and there. People read his prose writings before really seriously encountering the works. And so each of these components of the Wagner operation, the Wagner conglomerate, would kind of provoke conversations and debates, sort of each almost in a separate way. And I think the Wagner's eccentric strength as a dramatist has a great deal to do with why he had such a particularly profound effect on literature, even if ultimately music was the driving force. Music was what was most original and astonishing about Wagner. I mean, the librettos don't necessarily astonish you, overwhelm you, and transport you, as you read them on the page. The music does. The music did have this instantly entrancing power. And so that is ultimately the spark of the phenomenon.
Going through your book, though, and there's nearly 800 pages there, and to give everyone an idea of the vast scope of the book, which this man instituted, really, let me read from its 15 chapter titles, not all 15, but just some. As a prelude, you start in Italy with Wagner's Death in Venice, and then you turn, of course, to Germany with The Ring and the philosopher Nietzsche. Then you're off to France in chapter 2, the poet Baudelaire and the symbolists. And in chapter 3, you use the magical figure of Lohengrin, and we're off into Victorian Britain and 1880s America. Then there's decadent and satanic Wagner. And in chapter 4, and it's like the dark side of Parsifal. And it leads into chapter 5, where you come back into Germany, but some decades later, the Wilhelmine Empire and the Never Never Land, which is one of your own favorites, of the fin de siècle Vienna. Can we stop there for a minute and rewind? Can we get back to Nietzsche for a second, who appears as your first Wagnerian? Would you say he was the first real Wagnerian?
No, in fact, Baudelaire was the first real Wagnerian. But Nietzsche is a great place to begin because part of what I wanted to do in this book was to introduce people to Wagner himself, or refresh their knowledge of Wagner. And this is a tricky thing to do because, in order to discuss Wagner's influence and impact, you sort of have to assume a certain amount of knowledge of what is in the operas themselves. And so sort of sneakily, I did want to sort of bring people up to speed, especially for those readers who are not diehard Wagnerites, so that, with that sort of modicum of knowledge, we can begin to discuss the influence. And so the first chapters all depart from a description of a particular opera, or in the case of the first chapter, the entire ring is sort of organized around the ring, the genesis of the ring, the sort of Wagner's philosophical development, intellectual development, political development in the course of working on the ring, and then second chapter, the French Wagnerism takes off from Tristan. The third chapter takes off from, well, sort of Lohengrin and Tannhäuser, and so on. And then I, bring in Nietzsche as, I mean, he's kind of the archetypal, if not the original Wagnerian. I mean, he's the archetypal Wagnerian in that this sort of very common pattern of early infatuation, sort of this sort of early experience of being overwhelmed by Wagner and sort of swept away by him, gives way to a mature perspective. In Nietzsche's case, supposedly a rejection, but of course, Nietzsche never rejected Wagner. It just became a more complicated, more mature, more ambivalent, more tense relationship with Wagner. And this is just a common pattern that, throughout the book we see with artists. I mean, it's sort of rather similar to what happens with Joyce, who was very much a kind of enthusiastic Wagnerite in his youth, and then sort of becomes quite a bit more distant later on. A number of other figures follow that pattern. So I think it's just, for me, as an archetype of how Wagnerism works. And it's not simply a matter of joining a cult and then sort of giving way to sort of mindless enthusiasm. It is a contestation, and influence involves the anxiety of influence. Harold Bloom's pivotal idea, and being influenced, especially by a kind of towering older figure, can turn into this sort of Oedipal struggle where sort of that figure needs to be rejected or put at a distance. So just Nietzsche is just such a perfect way of introducing that concept in the midst of this exposition of Wagner's own life in and around the creation of the Ring Cycle, and Nietzsche playing himself a very important biographical role.
And the step from Nietzsche to Baudelaire is interesting because they both shared this fascination with not just the hypnotic, magical spell of the music, but also with the notion that Wagner was ushering in the kind of modernism that they were dreaming of. In fact, you use a phrase from Nietzsche throughout the book. You repeat it over like a leitmotif, forgive me. And it's the bit that's when he says, Wagner sums up modernity. It can't be helped. One must first become a Wagnerian. Can you speak about this modernism that Wagner ushered in through Wagnerism?
Yes, well, it's, of course, the word modernism or the word modernity. I mean, these are slippery concepts, which sort of the possible meanings and interpretations of them proliferate wildly. For Nietzsche, I think it had a sort of more specific and also somewhat sardonic meaning. Sort of, Wagner's modernity kind of elided in his mind with decadence. With a sort of modern, somewhat kind of untethered and sort of ungrounded kind of existence from which Nietzsche himself actually wanted to really break away from this particular form of modernity. But at the same time, I mean, it sort of has to be a compliment at the same time for him to sort of coin that famous phrase, "You first must be Wagnerian," and sort of coming to terms with Wagner is part of this process of becoming modern. So I think it's not simply sort of pejorative in that sense, and it's just there's a bigger implication that automatically comes into play with that word modernity, including sort of Baudelaire's modernity. And Nietzsche, by the time he was writing that, was well acquainted with Baudelaire's writing on Wagner and his personal experiences with Wagner. And he said that I think he said more or less that sort of Baudelaire was the first Wagnerian, or sort of this phenomenon really takes root in France. It was really the French who properly understood Wagner. And it was this argument pointed against the kind of official national German interpretation of Wagner. And so Nietzsche was rejecting that and sort of putting forward an idea of a more cosmopolitan Wagner, and sort of the French Wagner. And so by bringing in this kind of French understanding of modernity, modernité, this engages with Baudelaire's understanding of that word, which is something rather different. For Baudelaire, the modern was a kind of urban experience of these sort of fleeting, fragmentary states of being, something that had to do with sort of the chaotic kind of experience of life in the late 19th century in sort of the industrialized milieu. And interestingly, I think Baudelaire saw Wagner as integral to that kind of modernity, which seems counterintuitive, because Wagner, of course, was no kind of urbanite in terms of his tastes and outlook, and he's very often wanted to go back to nature and sort of the Gemeinschaft, to older communities, but he was urban nonetheless, and so with Baudelaire, Wagner becomes something almost indistinguishable from French Bohemia and sort of the forces and ideas that animated French Bohemia and the avant-garde, and sort of this portal to some other dimension, to a dream world, to the unconscious, to a state of extreme sensuality. And he talks about, in Tannhäuser, the counter-religion, a sort of satanic religion sort of emanating from the Venusberg. And these ideas are very, very different, of course, from the discourse that animated Wagnerism in Germany. And so, I see Baudelaire as the original Wagnerian in this sense of Wagnerism, sort of a figure of this international movement called Wagnerism, because he is reinventing Wagner, because he is transplanting Wagner into his own sphere and using Wagner as a tool to advance his own ideas. And sort of that pattern of Wagner being appropriated to so many different ends, and being sort of captured by so many different movements and philosophies and ideologies is really at the core of the story. I have to acknowledge that much of my understanding of French Wagnerism is owed to you and your fantastic book on Mallarmé and Wagner, which is such a rich consideration of the sort of the complexity of this phenomenon of French Wagnerism, and a great deal more ambivalence in Mallarmé's case than with Baudelaire, but many of the same, I think, patterns in motion. And I have to mention when I first met you, we were sitting at a lecture at the Auckland Writers Festival, and you introduced yourself, and I was just astonished. I was like, not the author of Mallarmé and Wagner, which is maybe not a reaction you get every day, but it was just it was a wonderful coincidence to.
Well, it was indeed. But one of the interesting things with both Nietzsche and Baudelaire, to come back to it, and it's not something you say in your book, but one of the things that fascinates me is that the two of them, I think, were responding to a much more expanded, a much more significant assimilation of what music could be, of what it was all about. In a way, I always think that around the end of the century, the listening experience was coming of age, and that Wagner was almost freewheeling on top of that and making musical mileage out of the fact that people were beginning to understand how to listen to music. And I think Baudelaire, with his modernity, with his spontaneity, his sort of freewheelingness, and similarly with Nietzsche too, they both were feeling that there were new ways of understanding things and that music was opening a door to this.
Yeah, that music can be, not simply this realm of wordless kind of inchoate feeling, where you sort of momentarily sort of transported into some kind of refuge and sort of think pure vaporous thoughts. No, music can be a medium for the transmission of ideas, a philosophical medium, a medium for radical cultural impulses, a revolutionary medium, a subversive medium. And that wasn't a new idea. I mean, I think that had been percolating all through the 19th century, the sort of steady elevation of music to a higher intellectual station from what it had been for centuries before. And Beethoven, of course, played a great role in that, and the sort of German idealist philosophy. But yeah, with Baudelaire and Nietzsche, it becomes more acute, and this sense that it has to do also with the sort of the idea of the Dionysian and the idea that this force can rise from music, which can act in society in very powerful and wild and unpredictable ways. And of course, this is something that Wagner himself cultivated up to a point. I think each of them took it further than Wagner himself really would have wanted to go in terms of sort of how music could actually act in society. I think both Nietzsche and Baudelaire had a more radical understanding of what music could do, what Wagner's own music could do than Wagner did himself. Of course, always had that rather traditional side to him as well. And so there's this radical empowerment of the aesthetic in Nietzsche and Baudelaire alike, and in so many who followed them, which is actually sort of, he goes further than Wagner himself went.
One of the things we're talking about, of course, is the European reaction, but the third chapter of your book, and later on in different parts, has one of what for me was the most welcome revelation, the deep examination of Wagnerism in America. In a way, the American population, the pioneer population, let's say, was taking possession of Wagner and sharing it around. They made really a different kind of perception of Wagner in America at that time. You call it Gilded Age American perception of Wagner. They had Coney Island festivals of Wagner, and they had Parsifal entertainments of Wagner. I think that's marvelous, the way it was being shared around in such a democratic way. They were not sending him up, but really taking their own possession of him. You don't get this fascination about America and Wagnerism in any other book that I know of. So was it an ambition of yours to show up front, maybe for the first time, the strength and depth of Wagnerism in America?
Well, no, I certainly wasn't the first. I mean, I have to mention Joseph Horowitz and his book Wagner Nights, which is really the revelatory study, I think, of American Wagnerism. And there have been a number of other important studies as well. So, to some extent, I was simply following upon Joe Horowitz's fantastic work, and he really talked about this peculiar or at least sort of different strand of Wagnerism in America, which was sort of the genteel Wagner, the Gilded Age Wagner, something that was sort of mostly free of these radical impulses that you see in France and also in Germany to some extent, and other European countries. But it wasn't without its quirks, and it wasn't without its eccentricities and also perhaps its darker side, or its sort of more shadowy side, because there are American anarchists and American free thinkers who identify with Wagner. And then there's sort of this curious adaptation that takes place where the Wagner heroes are melded with American kind of ideal heroic figures and sort of the sort of solitary hero of the Wild West. And so one thing I talk about is Owen Wister's classic Western novel, The Virginian, and how Wister himself was an avid Wagnerite. He actually went to see the premiere of Parsifal in 1882 he had ambitions early on to be a composer, and then he turned into the sort of popular author and wrote this best-selling Western, which became really a founding work of Western literature. But the hero, who's known only as the Virginian, and we never learned his actual name, seems in many ways a kind of updating of Lohengrin, and there's sort of clues in the book that sort of that might be a good way to approach him. And when Wister went west for the first time, he kind of saw the landscape too through Wagnerian eyes. In his diary, he compared it to the set of Die Walküre. And there are sort of other figures. Sidney Lanier, the poet, was very interested in Wagner. I talk about the more glancing kind of Wagner commentaries of Mark Twain and Walt Whitman and some others. And it's a rich field. I think American Wagnerism was just very much its own creature, its own organism. And I was fascinated always by these geographical variations in Wagnerism as you go from place to place. And Willa Cather, is maybe the best, the richest example of American Wagnerism.
Despite your modesty, Willa Cather and the section on Willa Cather in the book seems to me to be entirely original, entirely as though you had just suddenly fallen in love with this author and her writings, and you wanted to say, you devote a number of pages to her. And I have to say, she's not a well-known figure, but after this book, she's probably going to become so. You say that she's a fundamental influence in the spread of Wagnerism, and the book is convincing in that regard.
The Cather is sort of very famous among American readers, probably much less so abroad. And so maybe, especially for international readers, perhaps my chapter on Cather will bring more awareness to her work. There's just no doubt she is one of the great American novelists of any generation, of any period. Her involvement with Wagner does seem to have come as a surprise for a number of readers of the book, which I find that a little. I find it a little surprising, but it's welcome to me that sort of the book might have provided a fresh mode of understanding Cather to some readers. She did write an entire novel about a Wagner soprano, or sort of the early life, the training of a Wagner soprano, The Song of the Lark. And there are a number of her early stories which revolve around scenes of people listening to Wagner or playing Wagner, and some more glancing mentions in a number of the other novels. So this was a lifelong interest that Cather had in Wagner. And I'm not sure if anyone had quite expounded it at such length, or I think especially given Cather such prominence in the international pantheon of Wagnerian artists and authors. So you don't find Cather present so strongly in some other accountings of this territory. And so I think she deserved that close focus. And in fact, this is the only chapter in the book that's devoted to a single figure. Every other chapter sort of sprawls and sort of encompasses a great many figures all at once, and so Cather has a chapter to herself, and I think it's just in a book that does sort of range as widely as mine and sort of engages with hundreds ultimately of figures, even if only briefly. It's good to kind of stop and zero in on a single figure and sort of push this kind of endless sprawl of Wagnerism to the side. And so it's you mentioned sort of this feeling of discovery, and Cather was to some extent a discovery for me. I had read some of her work before I set to work on this book more than 10 years ago, but I wouldn't describe myself as would not have described myself as a Cather devotee. And I became one. I really fell completely in love with the work, and I delved into the world of Cather's studies. I went several times to Red Cloud, the Nebraska town where she grew up, and went to the Cather archives in Lincoln, and met a lot of people in those communities. And it was a very enriching experience for me. So yeah, I think the depth of that chapter kind of reflects my own the sort of the joy of that kind of immersion in the subject.
The American window, as it were, opens up a few other views for you. One of them is W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, as the Americans mention of him. That man was very interesting. It's part of your chapter on Black Wagner and gay Wagner and various oppressed minorities at the time who never had a chance to get into this picture before, and who you are now showing through another light and bringing to birth not just people like Willa Cather, the artists and so on, but people who are more tangentially concerned with Wagner, who became Wagnerites, if you like, almost as part of their everyday life. And Du Bois seems to have been like that. The man was very important. I mean, he was the co-founder of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of People of Color, for example. And yet, all the time, he had this wonderful experience of Wagner, especially the opera Lohengrin, which he virtually included in one of his stories.
Yeah, well, the chapter, the sixth chapter of the book is devoted to the question of Wagner and race. And it's sort of a shift to a more kind of thematic organization. The first 5 chapters are essentially geographical in their focus. And then these 2 chapters that follow, one is on race and one is on gender and sexuality. And I'm really taking up the topic of Wagner and marginal groups in society, minorities or sort of those who have felt oppressed in one way or another, and the fact that many people in those groups identified with Wagner or sort of responded to Wagner and saw their own experiences reflected in him. And I wanted to stress that because, of course, the prevailing understanding of Wagner is that he is this kind of monster of German nationalism and anti-Semitism, and that he's kind of the music of the oppressor in a sense. And in fact, there were so many outsiders and outcasts and wanderers who identified with Wagner. Not surprisingly, because outcasts and wanderers are so crucial to the operas. This figure occurs over and over. It was sort of an archetypal figure for Wagner, who was himself so often an outcast, an exile, a wanderer. And so I think in the sort of wider popular perception of Wagner, that association has been too often forgotten. So I wanted to sort of push that really to the center, but also to sort of study the complexities of the relationships. I mean, the extreme complexity of the relationship that Jewish Wagnerians had with the music and the composer, both those who knew him directly, such as Hermann Levy, and also sort of those who came after. But in a kind of provocative and contrarian choice, I begin the chapter on race with W.E.B. Du Bois, and I go from there. And I think it is a way of forcing a change of perspective, and saying, as unexpected as it may seem, this absolutely gigantic figure in the history of African American, not only cultural life but political life. I mean, if there's one absolutely great figure between Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, it is Du Bois, and an incredibly powerful intellect who continues to exert influence today. But he loved Wagner. He absolutely loved Wagner's music. It was a kind of unquestioning love, much more like Baudelaire's love, I think, than like Nietzsche's or Thomas Mann's or James Joyce's. And as a young man, he was studying in Berlin and heard the operas there, And much later, strangely enough, in the year 1936, he went to Bayreuth and was carried away by the experience, even as he was very aware of the horrors of Nazi Germany around him. And so he inserted Lohengrin into this extraordinary story, which appears in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, which is mostly a collection of essays and sociological interpretation and sort of philosophical commentary. But there is this one fictional chapter, and it involves a young Black man who goes to school and sort of has visions of bringing himself upward in life and improving himself. And he goes to see a concert and hears the prelude to Lohengrin and has this overwhelming experience with Lohengrin and is filled with visions of future possibility. He feels a movement of power within him, Du Bois writes. And it is an illusion, because he will soon be brought low again by racism, by ignorance, and it ends with him on the verge of being murdered by a lynch mob. But still, Wagner kind of floats above the horror of that scene as something else, sort of something other, something that one can reach toward. And that was how Wagner was for Du Bois his whole life. And I found, there are other African-American intellectuals and cultural figures who had relationships with Wagner, not as intense as Du Bois's, but there are enough of them to make you realize that Wagner actually, for I think that generation of Black intellectuals, became a model for how one could use one's own mythic past, one's own traditions in modern art, and sort of create this fusion of the ancient and the modern with perhaps Black traditions or even African traditions, as Wagner had done with Nordic and Germanic legend, and this is another pattern we see very often.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of this kind of Wagner model could be applied to by Black artists, Jewish artists, Russian, Catalan, Irish. So this idea that you can sort of apply the Wagner template to your own traditions.
It's particularly fascinating, this Jewish question, and indeed there's a person from the Wagner Society of New York who has a question. He got in touch with us and asked a question in advance, which showed a lot of initiative. And he was asking a question about Theodor Herzl, who comes in very briefly in your book. Poor man, he died when he was about 45, so he didn't make as big an impression as he might have done, but he was really the founding father of what we call modern Zionist separatism, if you like. And the amazing thing is that throughout his life, he was absolutely impassioned on Wagner. He listened to Wagner all the time. And Bill Williams said, when he sent this question to me, he said, ever since I read somewhere about Theodor Herzl's love for Wagner's music, I've been curious about him. Is it true Herzl thought music from Tannhäuser might be a good choice for the national music of a Jewish homeland? Do you know the answer?
I think what he said about Tannhäuser was that it was the kind of music, it's sort of the style of music. I think he was thinking especially of the procession of the guests to the Wartburg. He says we should have music along these lines, sort of grand processional music for our own rituals. The music from Tannhäuser was actually played at the second Zionist Congress in Basel. Whether specifically at Herzl's instigation is not clear, but it would be a good guess, that he was behind it, because Tannhäuser was the work that he specifically mentions as a source of inspiration when he was writing The Jewish State. In 1896, Tannhäuser was playing again at the Paris Opera for the first time, actually, since the great scandal of 1861. And Herzl was in Paris as the correspondent of the Neue Freie Presse, and wrote an article about that revival of Tannhäuser, a somewhat ironic, detached commentary, as would have been the expected style for the feuilleton page of the of the Neue Freie Presse. But privately, he extolled the work much more strongly. And as he was working on the Jewish state, he would see the opera every night during its run. And he said afterward in his diary that it inspired him, it gave him strength, and he said, only on the nights when there was no opera did I lack confidence in my ideas. So this is astonishing, and of course there must be a level of irony to this. I mean, Herzl was very well aware of Wagner's anti-Semitism, and so there is kind of a provocative element to this. But he's not saying this publicly. I mean, these are his private commentaries. So he is speaking to himself. And so we need to take it at face value that he was devoted to Wagner's music, or at least to Tannhäuser. We don't know what he made of The Ring or Parsifal or Tristan. And so this is a kind of Jewish Wagnerism, I think, which is different from the one that's very often discussed, which is certainly worth talking about, which is sort of the Wagnerism of a conservative German Jew who wishes to assimilate himself into the society and, in a sense, cover up his Jewishness by showing his devotion to Wagner. And so Wagnerism becomes a form of Jewish self-hatred, as the phrase went. Theodor Lessing wrote a book with that title, Jüdische Selbsthass. So that is certainly one type of phenomenon that you see. But there are many other forms of Jewish Wagnerism, and it doesn't always need to involve self-loathing or some kind of attempt to assimilate oneself to society. And so you see that very clearly with Herzl, and you see it with Schnitzler, and you see it with the remarkable Yiddish adaptation of Parsifal in New York by Boris Tomaszewski, which we have very little evidence of what that was like, but it was a Yiddish production of Parsifal. And so even in the Jewish community, Wagner takes on all these different implications and is interpreted so many different ways, even as people remain perfectly aware of the anti-Semitism.
Bringing this anti-Semitism and confrontation, as it were, to a head, of course, you have to move on to the figure of Hitler. We've been dodging him for the last hour almost, but he keeps coming back. You mentioned him as having Wagner as his favorite composer. Some people think it was Franz Lehár who was his favorite composer.
Well, I think toward the end of his life, supposedly in the last years in the bunker, he stopped listening to Wagner and sort of switched over to operetta. And he was obviously always very fond of Lehár, but Wagner obviously had a huge effect on him. And he had these encounters hearing Lohengrin and Rienzi and Linz when he was very young. And then when he first went to Vienna as a teenager, he went almost sort of immediately after getting off the train to the Vienna Court Opera to see Tristan and the Flying Dutchman. Tristan with Mahler conducting and Alfred Roller directing, incidentally. And so just his immersion in Wagner was deep. His knowledge of Wagner was fairly deep, and he was noted for his ability to be able to.
Knowledge was of a fandom version. He was more.
I mean, he wasn't. He never really gave evidence of having understood the sort of deeper psychological and philosophical implications. But he knew the librettos. He knew the music. He could detect when a cut was made, and this kind of thing. He had a good memory. Hitler had a good memory, and so he could pick up on that kind of thing. The depth of understanding is very questionable. But it was a real affection on his part. I think it was one of the few genuine things about Hitler, the few genuine emotional things about Hitler was his devotion to Wagner. And yet, the question always has to be, or the assumption always has to be challenged. Did that love of Wagner actually shape Hitler's ideas and his politics? And I doubt, actually, that Wagner shaped Hitler's politics to such an extent. And the reason I doubt it is that there's a considerable gap of time between Hitler's early immersion in Wagner and Hitler's political radicalization, or even sort of the very first evidence that he had political interest in any kind. It took place in the last years of the First World War and immediately afterward. And so there's no evidence that sort of Wagner himself somehow activated Hitler in this political sense. That came later, and I think it had many other roots. Wagner may have played a role, but I would not say that Wagner was the primary political influence, perhaps not even a primary political influence on Hitler. And it's quite a bit more complicated than that. And so I think I push back against the tendency to sort of demonize Wagner to the extent that you make him somehow an architect or sort of a prophet of Nazism. And there's too much in Wagner which points away from Nazi ideology to really make that tenable.
Things like the compassion of Parsifal and so on.
Yeah, but Wagner was really not that interested in the idea of an organized, militarized state. He sort of actively disliked the idea of a state with a standing army. He was enthusiastic at first about the German Empire, and then he turned against it. And sort of at the end of his life, he would sort of be sounding somewhat like a pacifist at times, and certainly sort of making anti-militarist remarks, and sort of this interest in the rights of animals and vegetarianism and sort of a group of beliefs which are sort of all over the political spectrum. And yes, the mysticism, the religiosity of Parsifal, the philosophy of compassion, the philosophy of renunciation, these are ideas that are really antithetical to Nazism and caused problems in the Nazi era. I mean, sort of Parsifal sort of particularly troubled certain Nazis to the extent that some of the Nazis, not Hitler, but some of the others, thought that it should be banned altogether.
One of the things that Hitler did, though, was that he tried to annex Wagner to his cause, and in fact to annex Bayreuth to his cause. And by the end of the Second World War, you would have thought that would have been an end to Wagner and Wagnerism, that we wouldn't have heard any more or seen any more. And suddenly he comes back again. You've got another 3 chapters in your book where Wagner has rebounded into the 20th and the 21st century. Isn't that remarkable?
It is, yeah. And I think it's testimony to the complexity of Wagner's influence, that, despite the horrible spectacle of Wagner being reduced to propaganda, and despite the fact that Wagner did play a role, did lend a handle to his own misuse, as Thomas Mann so beautifully put it. This was not a random accident that happened to Wagner, and so you would think that he would not be able to recover, and yet he does. And there are all these other sort of forces in Wagner which are kind of reactivated. In Germany, after the Second World War, there's a great new interest in the leftist Wagner, and the tradition of Wagner production, of course, undergoes this enormous development and diversification, beginning with Wieland Wagner at Bayreuth in 1951, but then sort of progressing well beyond that, sort of subsequent decades in Bayreuth and at other German opera houses. And so, when you look at the Hans-Jürgen Zuberberg and Anselm Kiefer and Joseph Beuys was very interested in Wagner. There are all kinds of Wagnerian mystical strains in the novels of Philip K. Dick. You have this whole kind of phenomenon of Wagnerism in Hollywood. Right from the beginning, Hollywood is saturated in Wagner, but then especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the rise of fantasy culture and sort of this sort of new popular culture grounded in myth and legend, and Wagner is very often lurking in the background of that. Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, and all the rest of it. And so, yeah, this, Wagner remains a cultural force in a really astonishing way, that sort of a figure from the 19th century could still be such a direct impetus for sometimes very radical artistic developments is really an astonishing thing.
Absolutely. And as we sit here, we are sitting here under the auspices of one of the 150 Wagner societies that are alive and active in the world today. And it looks to me like the art of the future, as Wagner thought of it, has still got plenty of art and plenty of future left for it. And Alex, we're going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid. It's been wonderful talking to you. I don't know where the time's gone, but the book is an absolute wonderful monument to Wagnerism and also to your research and study. Thank you very much for the book. I'm going to read it over and over again, and I'm not the only one who's doing that. Thank you for having been here and for sharing your further views about Wagnerism and the book. Lovely to have been with you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you so much, Heath. It was a great pleasure to talk with you. And thank you, everyone, for watching and listening.